Okay, I'd like to invite Alison Peirse onto the stage now. So she's going to talk to you, or stage, the centre of the room. She's going to talk to you about, as I said, a different kind of outsider, or exploring the idea, I suppose, of people who in the filmmaking community at least have been, to some extent, othered or exiled, which is the female filmmaker, and it's very pertinent, it's a very contemporary issue. A reminder as well, just before Alison begins, that Freaks is showing in here at 8 o'clock tonight, so if Jamie has piqued your interest with Freaks, then please do come along this evening at 8 o'clock and watch that. Okay, I shall hand you over to Alison.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm going to talk about women filmmakers in horror. So in the last 10 years, there's been an explosion in women horror filmmakers, both shorts and feature-length productions. Just a few recent examples include Pray No, Bailey Bond's Nasty, Prelude, A Love Story by England Simpson, and the extensive output of the Mexican filmmaker Gigi Salguero. So this seems great, doesn't it? Fantastic. All these women all over the world are now making horror films. But what these women lack is a woman-centered history to draw upon in the genre. Traditionally, horror has been written about as the domain of the white male auteur. And traditionally, the people writing about horror films have often been white men themselves. And the films that they have written about and the directors that they have chosen to talk about are often fantastic directors. But what we get when we have a history of that kind is only a partial history, an incomplete history. It suggests that women do not make horror films when right from the origins of cinema they have done. It also suggests that women are not the audience for horror films, when in fact this is not the case. So what I want to do today is talk you through a history of sorts of women filmmakers in horror. What I'm particularly interested in are women directors, women screenwriters, and women producers. This is because they have the most impact on story. And as a screenwriter myself, I am obsessed with story. I cannot get enough of story. So I'm interested in the women who have the most impact on the kinds of stories that are told and the way they are told. So to begin today, I want to point out one moment in the kind of histories that we're dealing with. So first of all, in Hollywood horror from the director's chair, Wilkinson interviews who he considers the eminent filmmakers in horror, and they're all men. In The Anatomy of Fear, the authors interview a range of people, but all of the people who are actually directors or key creative contributors are men. And you could argue maybe I'm being petty, maybe I'm picking small books that don't have much space in their history. Am I being pedantic? So the third example is Dennis Fisher's horror film directors from 1931 to 1990. This book is 867 pages long. In this book, Fisher talks about one woman director, and this is Stephanie Rothman, who I'm going to talk about a bit later. And he classifies Rothman as in the obscure or hack category. So when these histories are being written for people like Fisher, women directors make up 1% of the contribution to the genre. So let's begin to fix this today. Now, as I said, women have been working in cinema and within horror and horror-related genres since the inception of cinema. And I'll need to come back another time to talk you through early cinema to the 1960s, because I don't have time today. So for the purposes of the time, and to not give Russ an aneurysm, who's chairing me, I'm going to start in the 1960s with exploitation cinema. So thank you very much to Jamie for very clearly explaining what exploitation cinema is, so I don't have to. Essentially, there were three key filmmakers working in exploitation cinema in the 1960s that have had a big impact on horror. They are Stephanie Rothman, who I'm going to talk about first, Kat Shear, and Amy Holden Jones. Now, Stephanie Rothman is a really important example. She was the first woman director to go through the University of Southern California's directing program. She was the first woman to receive a directing fellowship from USC. And in her first role, she went to work as Roger Corman's assistant. After assisting Roger Corman, she went on to make her own very low-budget independent horror films. And the two most well-known are Bloodbath from 1966 and The Velvet Vampire from 1971. And I'm going to show you the trailer for The Velvet Vampire now.
You will meet her at night, in a dark place. She's beautiful, and she's waiting for you, waiting to love you to death. Who was this strange and beautiful creature who called herself Diane, who lived among the dead and the forgotten?
Diane, there's one thing I don't get. The headstone said your husband died in 1875.
And what were her sinister plans for the attractive young couple she enticed into her evil world? What was the source of the malignant power by which she drew them into an endless night of unearthly horror? Vampire, starring Michael Blodgett, Sherry Miles, and Celeste Yarnall, in a strange triangle of love and death and terror. The Velvet Vampire.
Fantastic. So remember, this is exploitation cinema. It's typically in these kind of films, the title and the poster would be designed before even the storyline. And the actual title and the artwork would be focus group discussed to decide whether it was going to be a hit, because that was what was important, getting people into the cinema. Now, Rothman has explicitly articulated herself as a feminist filmmaker. And what I want to unpick today is the idea that being a woman and your gender automatically gives you a feminist political position, when this is not the case. And it's problematic for women filmmakers, as we will see. However, Rothman is one of the people who considers herself feminist. And she talks about the Velvet Vampire. And she says, while in the Dracula films, both men and women were victims of the vampire, it was the women who always seemed to endure the ecstasy of having their blood sucked while laying passively in their beds. And if men were assaulted by vampires, it was usually while battling them, and they either destroyed the vampire or met a violent death themselves. So what Rothman wanted to do in her films was reverse this and have the man enjoying a masochistic, orgasmic death by the vampire while the woman battled back. Again, I could do the whole lecture just on Rothman, but as I'm attempting to give you an overview and some kind of key pointers for filmmakers and films you might be interested in, I'm going to keep moving forward, hopefully. Good. Okay. So we've already talked about Rothman. I'm going to come back to the other two filmmakers in a moment. We also have a number of other filmmakers who come to prominence in the 1970s. Karen Arthur is well known for the Mafu Cage, which is definitely currently on YouTube. So get it while you can, because it's incredibly rare. I checked last night. It's a very strange kind of psychotic women thriller with kind of primates. It's very strange, very unusual, and nothing like the kind of exploitation cinema we've seen so far. Though we also have Daria Nicolodi, who's the co-screenwriter of Suspiria, did the story for Inferno, has worked closely with Argento. And in addition, we have Deborah Hill. Deborah Hill is incredibly important generally for the horror film genre. She's the co-writer and co-producer of Halloween, the writer and producer of The Fog, and her connections and work with John Carpenter is well known now. These are three key examples, but again, moving forward into the 80s, we see a shift. So Jamie has already talked about how exploitation cinema was shown in grindhouse theatres, so kind of low-budget, small, non-studio theatres. But there was a big decline in cinema attendance from the 1950s and 1960s. And by the end of the 1970s, cinema attendance was at an all-time low. And what these grindhouse directors realised was in the 1980s, the straight-to-video horror market might be a fertile territory for their work. So what we see in the early 1980s are former exploitation and grindhouse directors making horror films. So we have Barbara Peters, who in 1980 directed Humanoids from the Deep. This is a really problematic film. Roger Corman was the exec producer, and he told her the pitch, which was essentially, a monster comes from the sea, the monster murders all the men and rapes all the women. When Peters turned the film in, Corman concluded, you've done the male murder bits really, really well. I'm very happy with the male murders, but the rapes are very shadowy. We can't really see the women being raped, and we really want to see that. So we hired the second assistant director to film explicit rape scenes, and these were then cut into the film. Peters then tried to have her name taken off the project, but was unsuccessful. A Night to Dismember is a big cult film. It's by Doris Wishman, who I think officially is probably the most prolific women director of American cinema. Wishman doesn't normally work in horror. She's a sexploitation director. But inspired by Halloween, which remember, co-written by Deborah Hill, she shot A Night to Dismember in 1979, and through post-production issues, it finally came out in 1983. And finally, we have Roberta Findlay, who is a fascinating character. Findlay started out as a cinematographer in the 1960s, and she's known most for very rough, violent, sexually sadistic films. She also went into horror in the 1980s and made a number of horror films, of which Blood Sisters is a well-known example. But what I'm fascinated by is that Roberta Findlay is so openly disparaging of her own films. She refuses to be considered an auteur, as having any kind of artistic practice. She says her films are garbage, that the people who enjoy her films are emotionally disturbed. And she said she is only in it for the money, and she has only ever been in it for the money, and she couldn't care less. And I find that fascinating. Yes, I can talk about that later if anyone's interested. So these are some kind of key examples as we move throughout the 80s, particularly in relation to the straight-to-video horror market. We also have Jackie Kong, who's a bit of an outlier. She doesn't really come from the House of Corman. In the 1980s, she shot her first feature film at the age of 23. Blood Diner is her second feature film from 1987, in which she channels Herschel Gordon Lewis and John Waters, who Jamie's already talked about as well. So thank you very much. I'll just give you the New York Times review first, and then we'll see the trailer, because Blood Diner really is special. So Karen James went to see this in Manhattan and was very upset. And she says, the only question worth asking about Blood Diner is, how bad can an exploitation movie be and still get released in theatres? The production is conspicuously low budget. The dubbing, lighting, continuity are amateurish, but none of that matters. This isn't a real movie, it's celluloid swill. So I'll show you the trailer now.
Ah, hello, fellow food lovers. I'm Phil Mignon, world-famous gourmet. In my travels, I've sampled some of the most exquisite foods the world has to offer. And that's why they've asked me to tell you all about a charming new eatery located right downtown. As you can see, the atmosphere is lovely. But, of course, the finest attribute of this quaint cafe is the marvelous cuisine.
By the way, what is the special ingredient in the Tuesday surprise?
Well, if I told you that, it wouldn't be a surprise anymore, would it?
They're mouth-watering specialties. Will have you, as they say, licking your lips. Only the freshest natural ingredients are selected.
The first ingredients we need are 2 stomachs from a couple of friends.
For use in their carefully guarded recipes.
I'd give my right arm for that secret recipe.
Yes, the chef puts a bit of himself into every succulent dish. And he's always pleased to serve you to your friends. Shouldn't that be serve you and your friends? No. Your gracious hostess will direct you to your table, where you will dine as if there's no tomorrow. So, breeze on down and don't let anything stand in your way. This Epicurean haven is called Blood Diner.
You got that right, homo.
So, this is Phil Mignon, saying bon appetit. Oh, Mommy.
The Blood Diner. First they greet you, then they eat you. No one under 17 admitted.
Jackie Kong's talked a lot about the problems she faced being a woman horror filmmaker. So she was still only in her mid-20s when she directed that. And Kong is of Chinese-American descent. And she said she would turn up to meetings and they'd be expecting a white man called Jackie and a small Chinese girl would come along, and they found it very difficult to conceptualize that she was the author, so-called, of these films. The films I've talked about so far are still films that are very much very low budget, very independent, very much on the fringes of filmmaking. But during the 1980s, we also begin to see women finally breaking through into more mainstream forms of horror. So in 1987, we have Kathryn Bigelow's Near Dark, the vampire movie. I won't go on about this. I'm sure you all know who Kathryn Bigelow is, and if you don't, you really should do. We've also got Pet Sematary, the original, directed by Mary Lambert. I'm aware that the remake of Pet Sematary is coming out soon, but I strongly advise you to go and watch the original again. It stands up really well. I rewatched it again last week, and it was really enjoyable. It begins very much as a family horror in the vein of something like Poltergeist, and then it just gets darker and darker and nastier and weirder as it goes on, until the final act you're like, oh, don't do that, oh God, no, please. So it's really worth revisiting. We also have the other Corman graduate, Amy Holden Jones, who began the Slumber Party Massacre series, of which there have been 4 films. Each of these films has an almost exclusively women-staffed creative team. So the Slumber Party Massacre, it was directed and produced by Holden Jones. It was also written by the feminist writer Rita Mae Brown, and co-edited by Wendy Green. And as the franchise continued, it's always had a strong women personnel. I'm not going to talk about these. Don't worry, this is impossible. But the 1990s is where women began to finally really become part of the mainstream for horror. So it's taken until the 1990s to get here. And that's one of the things that's interesting about feminist filmmaking. For filmmakers who often consider themselves very feminist, their work is often seen on the margins. It's outside of the mainstream. But this is the period when women film directors really get involved in horror films, often with bigger studios. There are a number of important points that you can pull. This is just a selection of the films from the 1990s that we could look at. There are a lot more. But there are a couple of key things. The first one is the predominance of franchises. So we have the Nightmare on Elm Street franchise, we have the Howling franchise. We've also got the introduction of studios that are more well-known being involved in horror, studios like New Line and 20th Century Fox. And then thirdly, we also finally begin to see some non-Anglophone directors as well. So everyone I've talked about so far has almost exclusively been a white American woman. But during the 1990s, we begin to see works like by Shimako Sato with Wizard of Darkness, and we begin to finally hear some of the voices of women who don't have English as their first language. So we're beginning to get the very origins of some kind of diversification of women filmmakers. One key director during this period is Kat Shear, who I mentioned earlier. Kat Shear is generally fantastic. Another Corman graduate, director and co-screenwriter of a range of horror films, including The Rage Carrie 2 from 1999. But my personal favourite is Poison Ivy, which is also fantastic. This is very much a teen drama, almost two-hander between Sarah Lambert and Drew Barrymore as like teens on the edge who were rebelling. It's a wonderful dissection of female relationships that goes to some very dark places. But this is also a point when we have the issue of gender and politics coming together again. So because you're a woman filmmaker, it doesn't mean that your film has to be feminist. I mean, I would hope that you were wanting equality, but you can't expect politics to be ascribed to someone. And in the same way, there are lots of male filmmakers that have made feminist horror films. The Craft from 1990, another teen horror, is one of my favourites, and that is an all-male production team. Yet it captures the insanity of teenage girls' relationships in a way that I've not seen before. So just because of your gender, it doesn't mean you're going to make films in a certain way. Yet what happens with films like Poison Ivy is that the critics automatically think about feminism because the director or the key creative teams are women. So again, going back to the New York Times, it's reviewed well. It did well, did Poison Ivy. It's a B movie with a vengeance, one that offers a wickedly feminine, though hardly feminist view of nominally happy life and its failings. So again, it's this sense that just because it's directed by Kat Shear and co-written by Kat Shear, in some way we have to engage with feminism, which isn't necessary. If we move into the 2000s, this is the point when horror explodes generally, globally. So if you know anything about your horror film history, we'll know we had kind of high points in the 1970s, It started to tail off in the 80s. Horror was relatively quiet in the 1990s, but by the end of the 90s, there was a huge global upsurge in the genre, evidenced by films like the Japanese film Ringu, the Blair Witch Project, films like this. So horror really resurfaced in the 2000s. And this is at the same time where women filmmakers really began to come through again. And again, there's just a few examples here. Key things to pick out are the second film, Gingersnaps. Has anyone seen Gingersnaps or heard of it? A couple of you, yeah. It's so cool. It's like a sister's werewolf movie that I just adored on site and is absolutely fantastic. But what we also see, again, is that sense of expanding beyond Anglophone cinema. We get the beginnings of the new French extremity, and we also get films like Jennifer's Body, directed by Karen Kusama and written by Diablo Cody. Basically, though, what happens after the 2000s is there's so many women making horror films that there's no way that I could justifiably do any kind of map from this point onwards in the space of this session. So what I wanted to do is just look very briefly at one particular filmmaker. And I've picked Ashlyn Clark, who's the first Northern Irish woman filmmaker in horror. Clark started in 2015 making shorts which were funded by the Northern Ireland Screen. She made a series of 1-minute shorts called Short, Sharp Shocks. And then she went on to make Childer, which is a 20-minute short film, which you can usually find on Vimeo. And I'm personally drawn to Clark because she writes and directs a lot of things about the ambivalence around motherhood and the difficulty of motherhood and how horrible motherhood can be. And that's something I think, I understand that. That makes sense to me. But I don't want you to think that just because she's a woman that it has to be about motherhood. It really doesn't. And again, it's that idea of like essentialism that we need to avoid. The reason that I'm talking about Clark today is she's very eloquent about what she's trying to do with her films. And I think it stands in very stark juxtaposition compared to someone like Roberta Findlay. So there's two key quotes I want to take from Clark. The first one is she is inevitably being asked, what's it like being a woman horror director? And what does it mean to be a woman when you make these films? And she said she'd like to see more female-led stories. Of course she would, and more women working in head of department roles. But it doesn't mean that we need characters that are strong female leads. She says she's fine with strong characters, but she's interested in characters that need to be there. She doesn't want a woman being inserted into a predominantly male story just so there's a box ticked for it being a woman. Instead, what she's looking to do is to find complex, three-dimensional female characters who act out stories that speak to and about female experiences. And the key point from this for me is that Clark argues female stories can and should be seen as human stories rather than niche. And this is where, if we think back to the history that I've talked about at the beginning in the way that these films are written about, that very narrow, partial view of men as the auteurs and women as the kind of victims on screen, that's just one version of the story that can be told. There are lots of other versions of the story that would have broad human appeal, and this is what Clark's interested in. She's just released her debut feature film called The Devil's Doorway, which is out now. And she's talked about this quite extensively. She's toured the festival circuit, and she's talked about this idea of telling stories and what that means as a woman director. And she says it's the human drama that she's interested in. The best horror has a human story at its heart. And really, the horror works as a metaphor for the humanity. And this is where I think she differs in the way she articulates her art in a way that's different to some of the directors that have gone before. So we're now finally at a point with women filmmaking in horror where directors are able to explicitly articulate these kind of aesthetic and emotional stories that they argue has a broader human appeal. And it's not just a niche film, but it's something that can resonate with all kinds of people. So for the last section today, I just want to problematize the entire concept of my paper. How long have I got? Oh, fantastic. Oh, great stuff. Okay. So I've been talking about women horror directors and what might a woman-made horror history look like. That is not always universally popular with the women filmmakers. So Mary Lambert, who made Pet Sematary, that we've talked about before, she's articulated her exasperation with this label on a number of occasions. And here she says, "It's a little annoying to be labelled a female film director because men are just directors. And then there's a double whammy of being a female horror director. Like, how many boxes can you put me into?" Okay? So this is an issue. But I would argue, because of the way that our histories have been written so far, it's really important to illuminate and celebrate specifically the women as they are simply not being written about before in our histories. And there's another reason why it's important to talk about them and to illuminate them and to have them written about for future work. And to explain this, I want to mention very briefly this wonderful woman here who's called Millicent Patrick. Millicent Patrick worked in the 1950s for Universal Studios. She worked in the art side of special effects, and Millicent Patrick is the woman who designed the creature from the Black Lagoon's costume. So she actually drew it, she trained as an illustrator and designed it. And Millicent is the subject of a fantastic book that's just been released by Mallory O'Meara. The book's called The Lady from the Black Lagoon, Hollywood Monsters and the Lost Legacy of Millicent Patrick. And in it, O'Meara talks extensively about Patrick's life, which has never been discussed before, yet she's made a major contribution to the creation of horror film monsters. And O'Meara talks about why it's important to put this into print. And O'Meara herself is a horror filmmaker, a woman based in horror in LA. She works for Dark Dunes Productions and has a number of credits to her name. And she talks about being a geeky 17-year-old girl who loved horror but had no kind of reference points for herself. And she found a picture of Millicent Patrick, one very similar to this, although this is obviously staged, one very similar to this of Millicent working in Hollywood. And O'Meara says, "As I worked my way into the horror film business, I thought of all the girls in the world, girls who love monsters, girls who love film. These girls are sitting on the sidelines. They're not content to watch, but they're filled with a frustrated desire for momentum and creation. All of these girls are potential filmmakers, but, and importantly, it's so difficult to be that something if you cannot envision it. If you don't see yourself in those books, how can you know that this is an opportunity for you? If you don't see those photographs of the crew, if we don't know about these women working behind the scenes, it is so much harder for the girls who do want to make films of monsters to come forward, because there is no path that is seen for them. As O'Meara says, to see no way in, to see the world you love populated exclusively with those who are not like you is devastating. So this is the other reason why it's important to think about these as women directors. The final point I want to make today relates to moving forward with this idea. So what I hope I've done so far is articulate the beginnings of a clear history of women filmmakers working in horror. And I'm hoping that I've convinced you that we have a long lineage of women working in the genre. However, this has not yet been recognised by many of those people in power. So very recently, Jason Blum of Blumhouse Productions, who make Paranormal Activity, films like that, he was questioned for the website Polygon on why none of Blumhouse's horror films have been directed by a woman. So women directors have worked for Blumhouse, but not in horror. And what Blum said was, there are not a lot of horror film directors, period, and even less who want to do horror. I'm a fan of Jennifer Kent, who made The Babadook. You know, that's like literally the only reference point anyone has. I'm a fan of her, but I've offered her it and she's turned it down, you know. What can you do? Obviously, the entire internet went insane when this interview was published, and Blum had to publish a retraction on his Twitter feed in which he says, "Thank you for calling me out on my dumb comments. I made a stupid mistake. I'm very passionate about this. 50% of my audience is female. These things matter. But we have not done a good enough job working with film directors, and it isn't because they don't exist. I heard from many today. The way my passion came out was dumb, and for that I'm sorry." But it's not just Blum. I've picked him out because he's an easy example. But even if we think about academic books, if we think about critics, even if we think about film festivals, we often find that the trope of the white male author is retained. There's a well-known film festival and conference in the UK called Cine Excess, which is something that I think all of us four have presented at or attended at various points in our careers. And they have a gallery on their website of all the filmmakers they've invited. And of all the filmmakers that they have invited, only 3 have been women, and of them, only 1 is a director. The other 2 are actors. And to make a brief point about actors, like obviously actors play an important role in the film and an important creative role, but women have long been seen on screen in horror as actors. Women have frequently been portrayed in horror as objects of representation. And what I'm personally interested in are the women working behind the camera, the women who have more creative and executive control. So somewhere like Cine Excess, the gallery speaks for itself. We have that same version of horror film history that we've seen so far. And this is a history that we can, if we want, overturn very easily. And what I would hope moving forward is that being aware of this, we can think about the good we can do as critics, as academics, as students, as archivists, making the prints available, as festival programmers, thinking about different kinds of filmmakers and really trying to illuminate the history. So there are more women like Mallory or Mira who can say, I can see that woman and that's someone that I would like to become. And in this regard, I want to finish with a final trailer. This is from the Final Girls. They're a London-based feminist film collective who are interested in feminism and horror. They have a touring festival series called We Are the Weirdos, which is a reference from The Craft, which I mentioned earlier. And it's toured all over the UK. For this festival tour, they've focused on short films. And We Are the Weirdos 2 happened in 2018. And what the trailer shows us is the real diversity of the kind of films that we can get excited about moving forward. So I'm going to finish with this trailer to give you a sample of what's to come next.
Hello, ladies.
Is this what I'm going to have to do?
So that's the final girl showcasing all women-made films. To finish, Deborah Hill has said, "I hope someday there won't need to be a women in film category. I hope someday we can just have people in film. And I'm hoping moving forward, we can get to that point sooner rather than later." Thank you.